Hey everyone, welcome back to another long, slow drift through history. If you've got your tea, your blanket, and the faint hum of existential dread about the state of the world, perfect. Tonight, we're going to sink softly into the oddly peaceful story of a man who absolutely did not want to be president, and yet, somehow, became the face of it all. Yes, we're talking about George Washington, the man, the myth, the slightly grumpy farmer who just wanted to stay home and count his tobacco profits in peace. He's on your dollar bill, he's carved into a mountain, and he's the reason powdered wigs had one last hurrah before fashion finally moved on. But behind all that marble and myth-making was a man who was deeply tired, and possibly just a little allergic to power. So dim your lights, slow your breathing, and let's drift back to the late 18th century, where the air smelled faintly of gunpowder, ambition, and horse sweat. Let's start, as we usually do, at the beginning or close enough. George Washington was born in 1732 in Virginia, back when Virginia was less about suburban sprawl and more about swamps, plantations, and questionable medical practices. He was the eldest son of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington, a woman known for being stern, sharp-tongued, and perpetually unimpressed by literally everyone, including her famous son. Now, George wasn't born into royalty, but in the rigid social world of colonial Virginia, his family was comfortably wealthy, just not dynastically wealthy. They owned land, slaves, and a decent amount of status, which basically meant George was born into that early American upper-middle class where you pretended to be humble while secretly judging your neighbors for using the wrong kind of silverware. His father died when George was 11. That left young George with a strange mix of responsibilities and insecurity. He wasn't poor, but he also wasn't first in line for much inheritance. So from an early age, Washington's main life skill was pretending to be more aristocratic than he really was. And he was good at it. He practiced penmanship obsessively, copied etiquette manuals by hand, and learned to move like a man destined to be admired by portraits. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate that detail. The teenage George Washington literally spent evenings writing down rules like Rule 56. Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation. And Rule 110. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. It's sort of cute and sort of concerning. But in fairness, these rules of civility would become the foundation for Washington's entire adult persona. Disciplined, courteous, almost robotic in his self-control. If he ever had a meltdown, we'll never know, because the man kept his emotions sealed tighter than a colonial liquor cabinet during a sermon. When he was in his late teens, Washington wanted to join the British Navy. He had visions of crisp uniforms, salty air, and maybe, just maybe, escaping his mother's constant criticism. But Mary Ball Washington, the original helicopter parent, said absolutely not asterisk. So George stayed in Virginia, pouting in a refined and gentlemanly way, and instead became a land surveyor. It turned out to be a surprisingly good career for him. He spent his early 20s trudging through forests, measuring land, and sleeping under the stars, all while quietly memorizing every inch of the territory that Britain and France were about to start fighting over. And then, the French and Indian War happened. Or, as Europeans would call it, the 7 Years' War, because they love to rename American conflicts like it's a Eurovision entry. This war was Washington's big break, and his first public embarrassment. He got his first command at just 22, which sounds impressive until you realize that half the army was made of confused farmers and the other half was dysentery. He managed to start an international incident by ambushing a French patrol and accidentally kicking off a global war. So not great. His early military career was basically a series of unfortunate events. Bad communication, botched retreats, and a disastrous battle at Fort Necessity, where his men got surrounded and forced to surrender. Still, Washington did what he always did, stood tall, said very little, and let everyone else project heroism onto him. He looked the part of a leader, even when his decisions were questionable at best. It's a lesson many politicians have since taken to heart. Posture and patience often outlast competence. After the war, George went back home. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children and an asterisk lot of land. It was a pragmatic marriage, but it worked. Martha was calm, dignified, and most importantly, financially secure. Together, they settled at Mount Vernon, a grand plantation overlooking the Potomac River. This was Washington's happy place. He loved farming. He loved fiddling with crop rotations, experimenting with new tools, and lecturing his overseers about efficiency. Though, of course, all that agricultural innovation depended on enslaved labor. Washington's relationship with slavery is one of those topics that makes historians sigh heavily. He owned hundreds of enslaved people throughout his life, benefited enormously from their forced labor, and only arranged to free them after his death. He was conflicted in the most genteel and delayed way possible. It's one of those moral knots that can't be neatly untangled, a man obsessed with liberty who denied it daily. Still, for all his contradictions, Washington's fame grew. By the time colonial tensions with Britain started bubbling, he was known as a seasoned military man and a respected Virginian gentleman. Which is exactly the kind of resume you need when the colonies start drafting a rebellion and realize, hey, we're going to need someone tall to stand in front of the army. The Revolutionary War began in 1775. And naturally, Congress looked around the room and picked Washington, mostly because he was the only guy who looked like a General Asterisk and Asterisk owned his own horse. He showed up to meetings in full military uniform, just to make sure no one missed the point. Now, the funny thing about Washington's wartime leadership is that he wasn't actually a tactical genius. He lost more battles than he won. His troops were often starving, sick, or shoeless. And yet, through pure stoicism and refusal to quit, he somehow turned chaos into victory. He understood the one rule of survival: don't lose too much. He retreated, regrouped, and waited until the British got bored enough to make mistakes. He was, essentially, the human embodiment of the buffering icon, slow, steady, and weirdly unstoppable. The winter at Valley Forge became legendary for its misery. Snow, hunger, frostbite, all while Washington tried to maintain morale and write angry letters to Congress about the lack of supplies. He'd end his nights packing in silence, a habit his soldiers found oddly comforting. When your leader is calmly staring into the abyss, you assume he knows something you don't. When the war finally ended in 1783, Washington did something extraordinary. He resigned. He could have seized power. People half expected him to. But instead, he walked away and went home. This single act earned him near-mythic status. King George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And for once, a king was right. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington planned to retire permanently. He built new barns, wrote long letters about soil quality, and complained about politics in that polite Virginian way that sounds like mild weather talk. But of course, history doesn't leave you alone when you're a walking symbol of national virtue. The newly independent United States was basically a group project gone wrong. The Articles of Confederation weren't working, and everyone was arguing about taxes. So in 1787, Washington got dragged, somewhat reluctantly, into the Constitutional Convention. He didn't talk much during the debates. He didn't need to. Just his presence in the room made everyone behave, like having your strict but quietly disappointed father watching from the corner. And when the Constitution was finally signed, it was only a matter of time before the same people turned to him and said, "Well, I guess you're going to be president now." He didn't want it. He really didn't. By 1789, Washington was 57 years old, worn down from war and politics. He wanted to retire, read, and maybe die peacefully surrounded by crops. But he accepted anyway, because deep down, he knew the country needed someone boring, trustworthy, and symmetrical to set the tone. And George Washington was nothing if not symmetrical. When he took the oath of office in New York City, he looked elegant and severe, part Roman statesman, part reluctant substitute teacher. There was no grand speech, no divine light breaking through the clouds. Just a tall man in a plain suit, swearing to do his best and already looking tired about it. That's where we'll pause for now, with George Washington stepping into the presidency like a man walking reluctantly into a committee meeting that might last 8 years. In Part 2, we'll drift through the actual presidency, the awkward cabinet meetings, the political drama he didn't want, and the endless tug-of-war between duty and exhaustion. So close your eyes, take a breath, and imagine the quiet hum of early America, carriages on cobblestone, candles flickering, and one deeply weary man trying to figure out what being Mr. President even means. We'll pick it up there next time. Welcome back, friends. If you're still awake, congratulations. You're either deeply invested in the life of America's first president, or your sleep playlist is malfunctioning. Either way, we're glad you're here. Last time, we left George Washington standing there in 1789, probably wishing he were anywhere else, maybe back at Mount Vernon, maybe in a quiet field watching his enslaved workers harvest wheat while he pondered the meaning of freedom. But alas, duty called and George answered. So let's pick up right there, with the reluctant president, stepping into a job that literally had no rulebook. Imagine this. You're sworn in as the first president of a brand new country. Everyone's looking at you like you're the parent, in a house full of hyperactive children with quills. There's no precedent, no official residence, no staff, not even a presidential seal. Washington had to invent all of it as he went. His first months in office were, honestly, one long stretch of bureaucratic improvisation. He spent his mornings writing letters, his afternoons in meetings, and his evenings enduring endless formal dinners where guests watched him eat in complete silence. He was the human embodiment of "please behave yourselves." And though he didn't want to admit it, he was asterisk good at this sort of thing. Washington's entire personality, cautious, methodical, allergic to chaos, made him the perfect stabilizer for a brand new republic that could have easily spun off the rails. The biggest early question was, what should the presidency look asterisk-like? Should he act like a monarch, or a humble servant of the people? Congress debated titles for weeks. Suggestions included His Excellency, His Highness, and my personal favorite, His Elective Majesty. Because, why not recreate monarchy with extra steps? Washington wisely shot all that down. He settled on the simplest title, Mr. President. It sounds mundane now, but at the time it was revolutionary. It set a tone of modest dignity, halfway between royal pomp and tavern chatter. Of course, that didn't stop people from treating him like a king anyway. Citizens bowed, artists painted him like Caesar, and foreign visitors whispered about his regal bearing. Washington himself tried to discourage it, but also, he wasn't exactly mad asterisk about the attention. Let's just say the man knew how to stand dramatically on a balcony. Running a government from scratch was exhausting. There were only a handful of departments, each run by men with oversized egos and limited patience. Washington's cabinet included Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, which sounds impressive until you remember they despised each other. Hamilton was young, ambitious, and believed in a strong central government run by smart, rich people. Jefferson preferred small government, farmer-led democracy, and lots of French wine. Put them in a room together, and sparks flew, metaphorically, though Washington probably wished it were literal so he could just leave. He often sat silently, while Hamilton and Jefferson yelled at each other, eyes half closed, radiating the calm despair of a man who regretted every life choice that led him to this meeting. He'd then quietly make a decision that satisfied neither of them, but kept the country functioning, barely. Washington's presidency was also one long balancing act between appearances and practicality. He knew the new government had to look respectable, and that meant he had to look respectable. So he hosted weekly levees, formal gatherings at his home where guests lined up to shake his hand in complete silence. People described these events as somewhere between church service and awkward dinner party. Washington would bow, nod, and exchange polite words, but never let anyone forget who was in charge. It was carefully staged humility, the kind that takes hours to rehearse. And of course, every tiny thing he did set a precedent. If he left the house at noon, it became a presidential schedule. If he waved too long, it became a presidential gesture. By the end of the first year, the poor man couldn't sneeze without creating a constitutional tradition. Let's talk money because, as usual, it's what everything came down to. Hamilton wanted a national bank. Jefferson hated the idea. Washington, he mostly wanted peace and enough revenue to keep the lights on, figuratively, since electricity wasn't really a thing yet. The debate over the national bank became the country's first big political divide. Hamilton argued for a strong financial system to stabilize the nation. Jefferson saw it as a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, the beginning of elitist tyranny. Washington listened, frowned thoughtfully, and sided with Hamilton. It wasn't a flashy decision, but it was monumental. The Bank of the United States became reality, and the federal government finally had a way to manage debt and currency, a move that would later make Jefferson grumble for decades. Meanwhile, Washington faced the first serious test of federal authority, the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were furious about a new excise tax on whiskey, because nothing says new nation like taxing the one thing keeping everyone sane. At first, Washington hoped it would blow over. But when protests turned violent, he reluctantly ordered troops to march west, about 13,000 of them. He even led them part of the way himself, like a stern dad showing up to shut down a rowdy college party. The rebellion fizzled out before any real fighting happened. But the message was clear. The federal government was real, it had power, and it was not in the mood for shenanigans. Washington's personal feelings, mostly exhaustion. He hated the spectacle, the conflict, and the growing sense that politics was turning into a bitter sport. Privately, he told friends that leading the country felt like walking on untrodden ground. Which, in fairness, it literally was. There were also constant foreign policy headaches. Britain was still hovering nearby. France was in the middle of its own revolution, and everyone wanted to drag the U.S. into their mess. Jefferson loved France. He thought America owed them loyalty for their help during the Revolution. Hamilton, meanwhile, leaned toward Britain for trade and financial reasons. And Washington, he wanted to avoid war at all costs. So, in 1793, he issued the Neutrality Proclamation, declaring that the U.S. would stay out of European conflicts. It sounds straightforward now, but at the time it was wildly controversial. Some saw it as betrayal, others as sanity. Washington, in his usual stoic way, didn't explain himself much. He believed neutrality was the only path to survival, because picking a side would have been national suicide. And honestly, he was probably right. By his second term, the cracks were starting to show. Washington's health was declining, the political atmosphere had grown toxic, and newspapers, once deferential, began attacking him mercilessly. Pamphlets accused him of monarchism, senility, even secret British sympathies. Some mocked him for his wooden dentures and stiff manners. The man who had once been untouchable was now fair game for partisan sniping. He hated it. He wrote bitter letters complaining that the infamous scribblers of the press were poisoning the spirit of the new nation. He had spent his life cultivating an image of calm dignity, and now it felt like it was all unraveling. Still, he didn't retaliate. He just endured. That was always his way: absorb the blow, stay silent, let time do the talking. And then there was Jay's Treaty, the diplomatic equivalent of a bad group project. It was meant to resolve leftover tensions with Britain, but the terms were lopsided. The Senate barely approved it, and the public lost its collective mind. Crowds burned Washington's effigy in the streets. Newspapers called him a sellout. For the first time, he realized that even he, the great unifying figure, could be despised. It stung deeply. Washington was never vain, exactly, but he cared about his legacy. He wanted history to see him as the impartial guardian of the Republic. Instead, he saw the nation fracturing into political factions, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, and he hated it. To him, parties were poison. He believed they'd tear the country apart, and in his farewell address, he said exactly that. Ah, yes, the farewell address. Written with help from Hamilton, because of course Hamilton had to get in one last word. It was Washington's final gift to the nation. He urged Americans to avoid permanent alliances, resist party divisions, and cherish unity above all. It was part sermon, part dad lecture, part existential sigh. And it worked for about 5 minutes until the next election. By 1797, Washington finally got what he'd wanted all along: retirement. He stepped down after 2 terms, setting another crucial precedent: peaceful transfer of power. He rode home to Mount Vernon as citizens wept, cheered, and tried to hand him bobbies to kiss. He smiled politely and probably muttered something like, "Please, just let me go home." At Mount Vernon, he was content, or at least as close to content as a man like Washington could be. He resumed his farming, complained about the humidity, and wrote endless letters about crops, fences, and politics. He even started experimenting again, with more efficient ways to grind grain. Because of course he did. Martha was relieved to have him back, though she noted that visitors never stopped coming. People just had asterisk to meet him, as if shaking his hand would somehow transfer patriotism by osmosis. In his later years, Washington seemed quieter, softer. He freed more enslaved workers in his will, a final attempt at reconciling his life's contradictions. And then, in December 1799, after riding through freezing rain and catching a throat infection, he died calmly, stoically, and still worried about paperwork. His last words were, reportedly, "Tease well," which feels fitting, not dramatic, not profound, just quietly accepting. George Washington's story isn't one of passion or genius. It's a story of restraint, of a man who wanted peace, kept his emotions under lock and key, and somehow built a nation by simply refusing to mess it up. He wasn't perfect. He was cautious to a fault, blind to some of his own hypocrisies, and far more human than his marble statues let on. But in a world of chaos and ambition, his calmness was revolutionary. So as we fade out tonight, picture that familiar image, the tall figure on horseback, looking slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. The reluctant president who didn't want power, but took it anyway. Because someone had to. Welcome back, night scholars. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've now survived 2 full acts of stoic American founding father energy. Tonight, we drift into the final stretch, George Washington's slow transformation from weary mortal into national monument. Last time, we left him back at Mount Vernon, finally free from the exhausting theater of the presidency. But here's the thing about legends: they don't retire quietly, they expand, they calcify, they turn into bedtime stories told by a grateful nation that prefers marble to nuance. So let's take one last, sleepy walk through the afterlife of George Washington, the man, the myth, and and eventually the myth marketed by an entire century of patriotic pamphlets. Washington's death in December 1799 hit the country like a cold front. The news spread slowly by letter and newspaper, but the mourning was immediate. Church bells rang, people wore black armbands, and poets churned out enough odes to wallpaper the eastern seaboard. What made it especially dramatic was the timing. The new century was just weeks away, and the first thing the United States got to experience in the 1800s was its founding father dying in bed, refusing medical bloodletting one moment, then politely agreeing to it the next. His doctors, bless their earnest incompetence, removed about half his blood trying to save him. He thanked them anyway. Even in his final hours, Washington was practicing that peculiar brand of politeness that doubles as stoicism. When he finally said, "Tea's well," it wasn't poetic flourish. It was probably just the 18th century version of, "Let's call it a day." The national grief was immense, but also strangely organized. Within days, memorial services were held everywhere from Boston to Savannah. Eulogies described him as a man beyond human flaw, a second Cincinnatus, the father of his country. It's interesting, because while Washington had been respected in life, he hadn't been universally adored. Plenty of critics accused him of elitism, monarchy-adjacent habits, or Hamilton favoritism. But death has a way of erasing bad press, and in Washington's case, it sanded every rough edge down to a saintly glow. By 1800, he was less a person and more a moral prototype, an American Buddha in a powdered wig. Congress wanted him buried in the U.S. Capitol. Martha, however, refused to move him from Mount Vernon. She knew what came next: tourists, monuments, and endless foot traffic. And she was right. Within a few years, pilgrims began showing up to his estate, eager to stand near his tomb and whisper patriotic things into the breeze. It wasn't an official shrine yet, but it was already functioning as one. Washington himself had once expressed discomfort about excessive hero worship. He wrote, "I am mortified beyond expression whenever I am made the subject of public acclamation." Which is, ironically, exactly what someone destined for eternal adoration would say. By the early 19th century, artists were mass-producing Washington portraits like collectible trading cards. Some showed him in military uniform, sword aloft. Others depicted him in Roman togas, because nothing says American democracy like pretending your president was secretly a senator from 44 BC. Painters couldn't decide which version they preferred: the gentle farmer, the stoic general, or the reluctant ruler. So they painted all three, often in the same frame. You'd get Washington plowing a field with one hand and crossing the Delaware with the other, while angels hovered nearby for reasons no one could quite explain. It was the golden age of patriotic exaggeration. By 1820, Washington was no longer just the first president, he was the example. Every politician who came after him invoked his name like a password to legitimacy. And of course, when people mythologize, they also simplify. Gone was the man who owned hundreds of enslaved workers. Gone was the tired, indecisive general who sometimes doubted himself. What remained was the flawless statue version, eternally noble, perpetually calm, impossibly good. Even the cherry tree myth, that charming little fable about young George confessing to chopping down his father's tree, emerged during this period. It was completely made up by a biographer named Mason Locke Weems in 1806. Weems wanted to sell books, so he crafted a moral bedtime story. The result: generations of American schoolchildren learning that honesty, apparently, involves confessing to tree murder. Washington would have rolled his eyes, politely of course. As decades passed, the cult of Washington became a civic religion. His birthday turned into national festivals. Cities were named after him. Counties, schools, rivers, even a mountain, because apparently one continent wasn't enough real estate for his legacy. When the U.S. Capitol needed a name, Washington was the obvious choice. So now, every time a politician in D.C. makes a mess, somewhere, in some abstract celestial afterlife, Washington probably sighs deeply and mutters, "That's not what I meant." Then came the Washington Monument, the world's tallest obelisk, designed to look both Egyptian and reverent, because nothing screams freedom like a 555-foot stone tower. Construction began in 1848, paused for decades, and finally finished in 1884, long after everyone involved was dead. It's poetic, really. A monument so slow and stubborn, it perfectly matched the man's personality. By the late 19th century, Washington's face was everywhere, on stamps, coins, calendars, and of course money. If you've ever wondered why his expression on the $1 bill looks vaguely like someone who just realized they're stuck there forever, well, that's one way to interpret it. The Washington brand became shorthand for virtue. Politicians quoted him, artists idolized him. Even cynics respected him, because, frankly, he didn't give them much to criticize. He wasn't particularly brilliant. He wasn't poetic or visionary like Jefferson. But that's what made him timeless. His greatness was built on S. He embodied something painfully rare, power without appetite. And that, apparently, was enough to make an entire country collectively swoon. Over time, though, the myth started showing its cracks. Historians began digging into the contradictions. The slavery, the elitism, the rigid self-control that sometimes bordered on emotional vacancy. Modern readers found him distant, almost too perfect to be real. But maybe that's the point. Washington was never meant to be relatable. He was meant to be reassuring. He was the blank canvas upon which the early republic painted its hopes for order and virtue. When the country was young and fragile, he was the steady father figure it needed. And when it grew louder, angrier, and more chaotic, he became the silent face reminding everyone that dignity was once possible. In the quieter corners of history, though, glimpses of the real man still peek through. Private letters reveal warmth, humor, and occasional sarcasm. He joked about politics, fretted about dogs eating his dinner, and worried constantly about appearances. He once wrote that he'd rather be on his farm than emperor of the world. You can almost imagine him now, standing on the veranda at Mount Vernon, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the Potomac. He wasn't thinking about destiny or democracy. He was probably just wondering if the weather would ruin his crops again. That's the Washington most of us never see, not the myth, but the man. Pragmatic, patient, and perpetually tired. 2 centuries later, his presence lingers everywhere, from street names to school murals to an entire city that can't seem to decide if it honors or haunts him. He is simultaneously the least interesting and most important founder. The man who wanted to be left alone and ended up being remembered forever. And maybe that's the gentle irony worth holding on to. George Washington didn't build his legend through brilliance or conquest. He built it through restraint, by doing less than he could, and doing it with unshakable calm. He was, in the end, the ultimate paradox, a leader who defined greatness by stepping away from it. So as the candle flickers low and the last echoes of colonial America fade into the dark, picture him there again, that tall, quiet figure in the moonlight, neither saint nor tyrant, just tired. He didn't want the crown. He didn't want the title. He only wanted peace. And somehow, that made him unforgettable. Sleep well, my fellow historians. Tomorrow, we'll wake to another century, one still standing in the long, steady shadow of George Washington.